In this lesson, we're going to look at behaviors, and what I've drawn for you here is kind of a guide to help you with some of the terms that you'll see in the behavior unit. So what I've done here is I've kind of made a little graphic to show you how taxes, reflex, instincts, and learned behaviors all relate to one another. The umbrella term here is taxis. And taxis are defined as general responses to a stimulus. If there is a stimulus, the response that the organism gives is either going to be a reflex, it's going to be an instinctual behavior, or it's going to be a learned behavior. And instincts are the simplest. These are neural responses. These are things that the organism can't think about or control. And the reason why they can't think about or control it is the signal never actually reaches the brain. And I've put a picture here to kind of guide you through what happens in a reflex. When you go to the doctor and the doctor uses the mallet to strike your knee, a signal is sent up your leg to your spinal cord. Okay, so it goes into your spinal cord. Your spinal cord takes that signal and sends a kick signal back immediately, back down to your leg, and your leg kicks. Notice the spinal cord has handled the situation. It never sent, normally the spinal cord would relay information up to your brain and your brain would process it and tell you what to do. But there are certain situations where there's really only one correct response and your spinal cord handles those situations through reflexes. But because the signal never makes it to your brain, you can't think about it or control it, so you can't stop yourself from kicking the doctor. So, for example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you reflexively move it off because the correct thing to do at that moment is to move it off, and you can't stop yourself from startling back and removing your hand because it's a reflex. Instincts are things that organisms exhibit from birth or hatching without having been shown, without seeing it, anything like that. That's instinct. And then learned behaviors are behaviors that are often called acquired behaviors because the organism gets those behaviors throughout its lifetime. And there are three types of learned behaviors. The easiest one is you get the behavior by watching others do it. You watch others and you mimic, right? Insight is learning by thinking through it first. Okay, so if somebody, for example, is really good at an instrument all of a sudden, like they just pick up the violin and they know what to do with it, that's known as insight, and that's because they've mentally worked out ahead of time how the violin works, and then they've played it. There's also something called conditioning, and we're going to talk about conditioning on the next slide. All right, so in terms of learned behaviors, we're going to start with the two types of conditioning. Classical conditioning was discovered by a guy named Pavlov. And you might have heard of Pavlov and his dogs, right? Pavlov had dogs, and he presented his dogs with food, and the normal response to food is saliva, right, drooling. He also presented his dogs with a bell ringing, and a normal response is not to salivate with a bell, right? But what Pavlov did for a long period of time was gave his dogs food, and at the same time he gave them food, he rang a bell. So they started to associate the food and the bell, okay? Eventually what Pavlov found was that he didn't need to present the dog with food to get the dog to salivate. Because the dog back here learned to associate the bell with the food, the dog salivated in response to the bell. So you get an unnatural response to a stimulus in classical conditioning, and because it's because you associate one thing with something else is often called associative learning. The other type of conditioning is operant conditioning, and the classic example of this is the rat in the maze. Excuse me, there's our rat, there's our maze. This is also called trial and error learning. Okay, trial and error learning. And you've seen little babies with those little plastic boxes that have the shapes cut out in the top, and they have little blocks that are match the shapes, right? And you've seen the baby try to jam the star into the circle, and then they jam the star into the square, and then eventually they kind of hit the right shape, and the block goes into the box, right? That's trying something out, making an error, and then trying something else and then making an error. That's called trial and error learning, and that's what the rats in the maze are doing. Finally, you also have habituation, and this, you can hopefully see the root word here, habit, in habituation. This explains things like why if you live next to train tracks or you live in the flight path of RDU, you eventually don't hear the train anymore, or you don't hear the airplane going over your house anymore. What happens here is that your brain learns to ignore a stimulus that doesn't immediately cause you any need to pay attention to it. So, for example, the planes that fly over your head when you first moved into your house, that really bugged you. And maybe if they came in early in the morning, it woke you up, it made you angry because you didn't want to wake up. But eventually what happened is your brain learned that the planes flying overhead were not going to hurt you, they weren't going to help you, there was no reason for you to wake up for those planes, and so eventually you got used to it. They became a habit, you got used to the stimulus, and then your brain told you to ignore it. All right, let's talk about a form of instinct, and we're going to talk about habituation, and this is Konrad Lorenz. And this is a picture, a very famous picture of Konrad Lorenz with his geese, and there's a number of these. What Konrad Lorenz realized, he learned that with animals, there is a period in their life, very, very soon after birth or hatching, where they do something called imprinting. And I just realized I messed this up. This is not habituation. This is imprinting. There we go. This is not habituation, sorry. This is imprinting. Imprinting is where, at this very early stage in your development, you learned to follow and trust the individuals who took care of you, and because those individuals were human, you act now like a human. Dogs, because their mother takes care of them when they're puppies, they learn to act like her. They follow her and they learn to act like her. So that's the stage where you learn to follow and act like your parents. Imprinting can get messed up, and please don't say Tarzan at this point. Tarzan is not a good example of this, and someday I'll tell you why. But for now, understand that imprinting, there's only been like one case, I think, of a boy in France who was literally raised by wild dogs. He was abandoned at birth, and wild dogs took care of him. And you can actually look this up. You can Google it. But he, I want to say it was like the early 1900s. When they found him, because he had imprinted as a dog, he would never wear clothes. He would never talk. He only made dog sounds. He walked around on all fours, stuff like that. So Konrad Lorenz figured out that imprinting happens. He got these little geese to imprint on him, and that's how he discovered it. All right, moving on. There's a category of behaviors. Some of them are instinctual, some of them are learned, but they're all called collectively social behaviors. Okay. Social behaviors are things like what you're seeing here, honeybee dances, so honeybees flying back to the hive and moving, and what you're seeing in the picture is when they move in one direction, it tells the other bees which way to go. It's like giving directions, okay? So it's saying fly perpendicular to the sun, turn right, then turn left, then go down a little, and you'll find a new food source, something like that. So the movements by the bees when they come back to the hive are interpreted by the other bees, and that tells the other bees where to go to find more nectar to make more honey. Here's an example of aggression, right? So territory defense. Okay, here's an example of courtship. This is a male trying to impress a female. You also have hierarchies like wolf packs. All of these are social behaviors. That's animals interacting with one another. Social behaviors require communication. Now, communication does not necessarily mean communication like you see with humans. Humans do a lot of talking to communicate, right? We do other things as well. We have body language and things like that. Animals do some vocalizing, but they also have a lot of scent communication, and this is where pheromones come in. Back on the animal chart, you learned that insects use a lot of pheromones. These are specialized hormones that you can pick up, you can actually smell. Now, humans may not detect consciously that we're detecting pheromones, but we do actually detect pheromones at times. But, you know, if you've ever seen nature shows where an animal is laying down a scent trail, or you let your dog out in the morning and your dog pees on all the trees around the yard, that's territory marking, and it's territory marking using the scent of pheromones in the dog's urine to mark its territory. So that's a social behavior. You also have rhythmic behaviors. Rhythmic behaviors are behaviors that occur along a regular pattern. One of those is the circadian rhythm, and humans have this 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, basically. Unfortunately for you all, this is hormonally controlled. And the reason why I say unfortunately is you're at an age where your hormones aren't doing what they would normally do if you were an adult. So your sleep-wake cycle gets really, really messed up. That will iron itself out. What's interesting about the human circadian rhythm is it actually exists independently of light cues. Okay, so in other words, if we could isolate you in a bunker and the lights were on all the time, and you had no time cues whatsoever, no clocks, no way of finding out what time it was or what day it was, you would still fall into a normal, regular sleep-wake pattern. There are other rhythmic behaviors that are a little longer. Annual rhythms are longer sleep-wake cycles, like hibernation and estivation. Now, hibernation, everybody knows this, right? Bears hibernate in the wintertime. Estivation is the same thing, except it's when animals go to sleep in the summertime. A lot of desert animals will estivate, okay? Then you have this other rhythmic behavior that applies to plants. It's called photoperiodism, and this is a flowering cycle, and the plants can actually flower because of a hormone that they produce, or sorry, a pigment that they produce called phytochrome. And the amount of phytochrome that they produce tells the plant whether it's what season it is and whether it's time to start flowering or not. Speaking of plants, there are behaviors that plants have. Now, this is not on your note sheet, but I want to mention this. I'm going to just quickly, because I'm running out of time for this video, but I want to quickly point out that plants also have hormones. Because they don't have a nervous system, plants produce hormones to control their bodily functions. This is a short list of hormones. There are more, and at some point you're going to want to pause this and get this into your notes, what each of these does, okay? But we're going to move on from here, and I want to explain how these hormones actually work to produce behaviors in plants as well. Okay, so plants also exhibit behaviors, and there's two categories of behaviors, and the first of these is tropisms, and you'll notice tropism, all of them involve the word growth, okay? In a tropism, the plant grows in a direction either toward or away from a stimulus. If it's toward a stimulus, we call that a positive tropism. If it's away from a stimulus, we call it a negative tropism. All of these are hormonally controlled behaviors of the plant, okay? The thing about tropisms is they're permanent. Once a plant has grown in a particular direction, it can't ungrow or regrow, okay? So the only thing you can do at that point is to cut the plant back and let it grow again. If you've ever had a plant that you've grown in a window and it's done phototropism, where you haven't turned the plant, it just kind of grew in a direction, like toward the window, the only way to get the stem to be uncrooked is to go ahead and cut the stem back and let the plant regrow. There are also things called nastic movements. Okay, nastic movements. This is where the plant actually physically moves. Okay, and again, hormonally controlled behavior. This is not permanent because the plant can actually move and then it can actually move back. So it's not a growth, it's an actual movement. So thigmonastic movement is touch. This is like where the Venus flytrap, where the leaves can snap shut and then open back up. You also have things like sunflowers, where the heads of the sunflowers move in response to daily light cycle. That's called nyctinastic movement. So sunflowers are called sunflowers because their head follows the sun as it moves across the sky. And every day the sunflowers face one direction, by night they're facing another, by morning they're facing that same direction again. So that's a reversible movement.